I dropped a whole 147-page contract document in.
The Applied AI Podcast, where tech meets ROI.
Mind blown.
Welcome to Season 2 of the Applied AI Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Andra, and I'm very excited about today's guest. Cydni Tetro really gets it when it comes to large-scale digital transformation projects, how complex they are, and all the moving parts that have to align to make them successful. Enjoy. Welcome. I have with me Cydni Tetro. Cydni, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, well, super grateful to be here today. Talk a little bit of, about what we're jumping into today, especially in this whole changing AI economy. Had this really awesome opportunity over the course of my career to be at that intersection of how do you build and deploy innovation that transforms companies or customer experience, right? Sometimes it's operational, sometimes it's company or customer facing, and really think about what that looks like. And I've had this opportunity to do it across so many different sectors and with so many different innovations. Obviously, today I anchor a lot in AI. And I've been, I started my career by coming out as a graduate from computer science. And that's really been the thread, that technical thread through my entire career of thinking about how is technology transforming what's happening? And then how do you implement that? And that took me on a journey of spending about 6 years at Disney. I'm in Imagineering, figuring out how we would commercialize innovation and deploy it across business units, all of the way up into being the CIO of one of the largest bottlers at Coca-Cola. Like, what does it look like to, have just 8,000 employees and drive transformation for them and infrastructure in a world that is changing very rapidly, but still has operational execution challenges. And so it's been an awesome opportunity in my career to span that entire ecosystem.
Yeah, very impressive background. And today you're with a private equity firm. Maybe say a little bit about that and also about the impressive work you're doing with the Women's Tech Council.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So today I'm spending my time basically, like you just said, taking a portfolio of companies that span from consumer products all the way to technology, all the way to real estate, and thinking about how are we driving the transformation and the growth of those in a world that looks much different than it did even 5 years ago, which has been really awesome. We've got lots of really interesting companies inside of that portfolio that we're doing. And then really, while I built my entire career, one of the observations I had early on is I was like one of three women graduating computer science. And as I entered my career, I realized that there was a great opportunity to leverage the minds and the skill set of women who were coming into that, who were really 50% of the workforce. And so almost 17 years ago, we created the Women Tech Council, focused on the economic impact of women in technology from high school to the boardroom, and really creating high performing teams that have both men and women sitting at those table. And there's different needs at all of the pipeline. We have a high school program that has about 3,500 girls in it every year. 40,000 girls have come through it, all of the way up to the 20 plus thousand people we have in our community that go all of the way up to the C-suite and the boardroom. And our ecosystem, the thing I love most is it's a strong partnership between men and women. It's not just one group of people talking. The true transformation happens because of such a strong collaboration we've really had from the beginning.
Yeah, and I think that work is so important. And I love what you just said. And women are very underrepresented in the tech sphere, and it seems like a big reason for that is of course the issue of representation that maybe girls don't see as many women in those fields, and they aren't as likely to go in those fields. So the more that we can encourage that, then the more they might see that as an option or a possibility for themselves. And I think that is up to all of us to encourage that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think you hit exactly what we found, which is how we ended up anchoring our SheTech program, is that girls don't know any other women in tech because there haven't been as many. And so they didn't even realize it was a possibility of something that their skill set could be applied to. What's been cool about that program is today about 400 girls graduate from the higher education system into STEM degrees because they got activated in high school through SheTech, which is driving like $32 million of economic value to the state annually as those girls come in. So we've really seen that thread go all the way through. Like, you do exactly what you say. You put them in touch with people who look like them or inspire them in different ways. And all of a sudden, the world becomes bigger than they imagined, and they see themselves in a place. And I think that's true for everyone in so many different ways. But those opportunities, when those doors are opened, their worlds change, and it's meaningful for them, their families, communities, and the future.
Absolutely, and it creates this virtuous cycle because each female now in tech can inspire multiple others who now see somebody who they can identify with, and now it opens that door. And it's not that all of them are going to be a fit for that, but at least the possibility
That's
is
right.
there. At least they can consider it as an option.
Well, and I feel today that all of our children are going into this AI driven economy, right? They're digitally native. They're going into an AI economy. And so it's already part of this DNA that they're part of. We can give them the tools for how they help us solve big world problems, how they're part of the evolution and solutions in the things we're solving today, because we really need their thinking and we need them to appreciate that they have a place in that space, because that's how the world is going to be shaped for the future.
Yeah, that's so true. And speaking of the AI economy, let's jump right into the main topic of the day. This is the Applied AI podcast. And I wanted to start our conversation around AI with a specific framing, which is, you come from this world of large tech transformation. You understand enterprise digital transformation and those types of projects and what it takes to make an organization more intelligent, more integrated, and all of that. A lot of the discussions around AI these days, both in the public sphere and at Talbot West, when we go talk to clients or potential clients, a lot of the discussion initially starts with this idea that individuals can use a tool like ChatGPT or Gemini to become more efficient in individualized task types. We use a metaphor, we call it the onion metaphor, that those types of tasks, if an individual can easily adopt a tool and there's very little like solutions engineering needed and they can make their individual tasks more efficient, that's living more around the outside of the onion. And that to get deeper into the core requires, the thornier problems of data integration challenges, systems engineering, all of those sorts of things that are a bit harder to do. And so I wanted to get your perspective on that. I mean, do you agree with that general kind of mental model? What have you seen? Do you have any insights on this?
I have the exact same observation. And it's interesting. I actually taught an AI curriculum the last semester or the last couple of months. And that was one of the challenges I always gave everyone in the class too, is this idea of oftentimes you're thinking about AI as how it helps become a force multiplier for you individually, which it does. Right? AI is interesting because people are using it in their personal lives, which is then transferring to work. And so they're seeing this idea that they can become faster, more efficient, have a strategic thought partner, all the things that I use it for every day of my life in my ecosystem. But when you go to transforming enterprises or corporations or the applications, the stack of things is different. And I think it's actually hard for people to think about, well, how does my job really change? Like, what is AI? What's transformation? Not for me in my daily task, but if you think about transformation, about what is now possible here that has never been possible before. And some interesting, places that, as some examples, I was working at a company, we were looking at a procurement application, right? And we're like, okay, we have kind of not a really standardized procurement. We have tens of thousands of contracts. Should we go use AI to help us read these, categorize information, come up with a structured data set in order for us to be able to better manage dates and inputs and all of this? And it was really an interesting evaluation because in that case, what we found is that the amount of effort to go create structured data for a team of 2 to 3 people didn't have an immediate ROI. So it was a more complicated enterprise project. So I think the thing and that we're all every enterprise is struggling with is, where can you see value in implementing AI? Because it requires a people transformation. It requires deep understanding of the data and having data available in order for you to create the amplification. And then also, I think you have to build a roadmap of, how do I see value today, in the future? Where does it come at? Is the infrastructure ready for this? And really think about, what is this going to transform, and what are the places where I should go first so that I demonstrate value? And it is not a simple lift inside of an organization. And I think we can talk a little bit about some specific examples in this case. But enterprise transformation for AI requires a whole stack of things to be true, from culture to people to systems. And you also have to appreciate the transformation you need as a business. That's hard for companies.
Yeah, you said so many good things in there that I want to drill down, and I just want to put a pin in and return to, because you offered some specific examples. I want to get to that, but I just want to make a couple of observations before we dive into that, which is we're always trying to kind of balance two imperatives, and you hit on this. On the one hand, you have to set foundational capabilities that might not have an immediate ROI, but that then build toward future initiatives that have an ROI. But at the same time, you're trying to find those quicker wins, and often those are more on the outside of the onion. They might be more like individual tasks that can be automated with very simple tools, and there's not a lot of integration challenges there. So usually trying to balance those two imperatives. But you're right that a lot of times what a corporation needs is those foundational, might be data readiness, might be other things that you're sequencing toward a future ROI that is a ways down the road, and that can sometimes be a harder sell. But if leaders have vision, and are willing to invest in that, they're going to be glad they did later on. So I don't know if you have any comments on that, but I'm very eager to hear these kind of specifics you were offering a moment ago.
Well, there's kind of two camps, or maybe two or three camps, I should say, for how you think about this. So first of all, in an enterprise application, AI is so much driven by data, right? So you have to be able to have information that it can digest in order to figure out how it becomes generative or agentic. It can't do things on its own. And inside of the corporation, the most important thing is that you're protecting IP. And so you end up having to create some infrastructure so that the data that's imperative and super important to an organization, that IP is protected. It's actually the reason I think Microsoft is currently winning this game, because what they've done with the Microsoft and the Azure stack and allowing people to basically create their own OpenAI instance is allowing organizations to move a fair amount further and protect their IP. Now, other people are trying to figure this out, but Microsoft has a lead, if you ask me, inside of that space. So you have many implementations that need data, and some places in your organization, it's easier to get the data that can feed a system than others. As an example, in your IT organization, there's so much happening in AI with cybersecurity, which is really fantastic. And I would say at some level, those are a little bit easier to implement because the data, the attacks that are coming in tend to be somewhat centralized into a system already and somewhat structured. Because even if you have a little bit of an older system in cybersecurity, the data is usually coming into a funnel that's being evaluated. And so in that case, getting your data ready in order for an implementation is much easier than in some other places of your business, which take many data sources. We actually looked at a whole bunch of AI tools as our frontline defense from attacks, specifically around adding more sophistication on things like email phishing attacks or other attacks that are coming in. Like if you think back to the CrowdStrike incident that happened about a year and a half ago, right? How do you prevent those? Or instances that you hear all the time. The biggest threat for any organization in their cybersecurity space are internal people who click on links, who fall into phishing traps, who actually open connections outside. We implemented an AI tool on the front end of cybersecurity very, very quickly because that data was easy to access. So it was already a single point, put in another AI tool, and we were looking for sophistication in watch email sentiment. Like, who is sending this? Does it feel like it's nefarious? Not just the standard data structures. We wanted tone, we wanted origination, we wanted a whole bunch of triangulation of things. That program only took us, I think, 60 days total from the time we decided to implementation because the data was centralized. The data didn't have many different points. So I think there's places that you can find wins for that. Now, when we implemented an AI tool on our help desk, that needed all sorts of data sources. That's a different problem, much longer timeline in order for it to get smarter for the internal help desk. And then there's other instances when I think about enterprise transformation. So in the consumer space, there's Microsoft actually invested in a company called SiteMachine and did a fair amount of work with SiteMachine, who was thinking about how do you add AI to manufacturing lines. In the manufacturing world, if you can think about how you reduce unplanned downtime and figure out predict preventative maintenance, you create huge transformations for manufacturing. Because anytime your line goes down, it's typically costing you dollars because you produce product on those lines all of the time. And so that specific implementation, which we might want to talk a little bit about, is really fascinating because it is a true transformation and a very big lift when you're thinking of like legacy system transformation. So maybe as I pause here for a second, I think there's 3 different buckets you end up with AI in the enterprise. You end up with ones that have easy data sources that you can easily implement transformation. You have legacy systems with legacy data that you have to transform. Those are bigger lifts, require more buy-off. And then you have distributed data sets that are not legacy systems, but they're distributed data sets that have to be organized that can then create transformation, but they also have a different set of structure that they need. Most enterprise projects are falling into one of those three buckets. The way manufacturing facilities are set up is they have what are called OT networks, which are different than IT networks. So your IT network is the one we're all familiar with. Every one of your employees, they come and they get on all of your services that are there. In a manufacturing world, manufacturing plants have operational technology networks, which have traditionally been isolated from the IT network. And the OT networks, they run the plants. So they run all of the equipment in all of the plants on a specialized network. And typically a manufacturing plant has its own system engineers, has its all own like intranet inside of a facility that they're managing and that keep all the systems up and that they run, which is really awesome and a fascinating challenge in a world that really, in order to deploy AI, requires a connectivity to the outside world, which never had to happen before. So just pause on that for a moment. It means that the OT network and its architecture never had to mirror an IT network, and it didn't have the same risk structure. But as you move into an AI world, all of a sudden, you have to start opening the OT network to the outside world for computation needs. That creates a whole other series of risks most people are not prepared for. So
I suppose you could deploy a bunch of on-premises stuff that incurs extra cost.
you
Things
could.
don't necessarily have to be connected to the cloud, but I think in a lot of cases people would rather be connected to the cloud, and so then in those instances, you're right.
Yeah, you don't have to for sure. You could, but the OT network teams never really had to do that before. Like their on-prem stuff is typically their line work, right? All of a sudden you add in what you're talking about, it's a whole other level of maintenance and management that
It
you
is.
didn't develop the skill set for inside of that team. So this is like just a fundamentally interesting challenge inside of manufacturing. And plants are getting more advanced, so they've been starting to make this migration. But when you think about a manufacturing line, manufacturing lines can have hundreds of decision control points that are connected to the OT network. And so when you go to deploy AI on those, you end up enabling each one of those data collection moments that are already part of the system with a sensor that is now going to give you fault codes. It's now going to give you data, computational data about how well it's performing and running. And now it's going to feed huge amounts of data into a system. So when you deploy on a manufacturing line, you actually put sensors, like hundreds of sensors, in partnership now with what's already on the line. And oftentimes, the infrastructure that was already there that was providing some of those default codes to the OT network it only had to provide almost like binary outputs versus lots of sophistication or fault codes that were structured slightly differently than what you might do when you go to apply AI into them. So these new sensors are now actually having to figure out how they work in a legacy world that has legacy, because manufacturing lines around the country, some of those lines are 20, 30 years old. Like if you invest in a manufacturing line, you don't upgrade this every year. It's too expensive. So you're trying to get your lifetime value out of this ecosystem. So you end up having to transform an entire OT network with sensors, with new network connection devices, thinking about how it goes to the outside world, the cybersecurity of that, all of the protection of your line, the data that you're going to get in order to do this. And it's a very big transformation. And so the most successful ones I've seen have been identifying a line that you can transform on that has maybe not all of the old legacy. And if it's brand new, it's probably has more sophistication. So you're kind of somewhere in the middle. And then basically identifying what's the thing that's most valuable first, because the line can do many things as it gets upgraded, but those many things will overwhelm the manufacturing team very, very quickly because they can't absorb all the changes fast enough. So are you trying to go to predictive maintenance? Are you trying to go to reduced unplanned downtime? Are you trying to go to a virtual view of a line so when there is an issue, your team members can look at an iPad and say, hey, this is where the line went down. Let's go solve that problem immediately so that we get back up faster. So you end up, I think, in any instance saying, which is the most value add for our business? Where do we think we're losing the most money? And then optimizing it so that everyone gets a win there. It's basically applying your MVP strategies in the enterprise, and the enterprise doesn't think like that. The enterprise thinks like full scale transformation. And I'm always the advocate of like, what's the killer application? What's the thing that will transform our company right now? Let's do that thing really, really well. And then it buys us the right to do the rest of them in sequence. That mindset, I would say, is one of the biggest challenges.
I love that. And we take the same approach. And, it's a non trivial task to do the upfront evaluative work to scope it properly and identify what that single best use case is to start with and make sure that it's actually doable and you have
Right.
your precursors and your dependencies ready and all that. There's a lot to evaluate to even identify what that single best use case is and make sure that you're targeting the right one. So when you do it, it's going to be a success.
That's right.
Success.
That's right. It's a big job, and you have to really appreciate the transformation for the people, right? Like the new job that you're asking them to do and bring them along as a partnership so that you identify risks early and get them integrated into a successful deployment. It's, I think, one of the greatest challenges because it really can change an organization. If you can reduce your unplanned downtime by even 10%, it's usually millions of dollars back to the company. That's very, very meaningful. And so your ability to plan and do that transformation, but also create a team of people that you bring along because it's a new world for them is hypercritical.
Yeah, so true. And that brings me to another point. There are all these now studies coming out showing failure rates of AI projects not showing meaningful ROI. Study from MIT, I think some others as well, but it's pretty high. And so if we broaden out, maybe even beyond manufacturing to just kind of enterprise in general, I've seen from some of my own experience some common patterns around why these failure rates happen. Looking at projects that have failed where we're coming in to try to clean it up. And, just from what I can tell, what I can read about these studies and industry wide, it seems like there are some common patterns in failure rates. Have you seen that as well?
I mean, absolutely. I'd be interested. What are like your top three patterns you see when something fails?
I would say the number one pattern is not scoping it right to begin with. So you're either tackling the wrong problem because you haven't done that preliminary work to make sure you're tackling the use case that actually is going to drive meaningful value and is actually achievable. You're tackling it with the wrong tool, like you're trying to use a large language model to do predictive analytics on a massive data set. It's just not the right tool for that. There are much better
Yeah.
machine learning models out there for that. Or maybe you could layer a large language model on top as a translation layer, but you wouldn't use it
Right.
to do the heavy lifting. So you're using the wrong tool for the task. So, just stuff related to scoping and evaluating and making sure you have everything properly lined up so that it's going to be a success. And then, yeah, just these things are complex. There are a lot of dependencies and adjacencies, and it's actually really hard to get a handle on all those. And so any one of those can derail a project or, cause it to stall out if
Yep.
if somebody hasn't paid attention to it. So there's just a lot of mapping. I guess that all really falls under the category of scoping, but there are different like subcategories under that. But I think if you do all that work, you set yourself up to have an extremely high likelihood of it working out. And then I guess for me, the other aspect, in addition to all that scoping, is the human side, the change management. You can do everything else right, and if no one wants to use it, it's still not going to be a success. So I think if you pair the proper scoping, very thorough scoping process with the human change management side, making sure it's something that people are actually going to use, working with the people, you bump that success rate, pretty high. What do you think? And have you seen anything like this, or have you seen different failure reasons?
No, I mean, I think they categorically end up in those buckets. I think one of the other places people fail is that they try to take down too much at once, which does one of two things. One is it means it takes too long for anyone to get value, which is, I think, what you see in the MIT report also, is that people are taking these massive projects where nothing's ready for them. And then it takes years. And so the ROI doesn't come back into the organization. I very much wear my startup hat when I think about this, which is how do I create a minimum viable product that demonstrates the value, that does something that we can scope adequately and that you can continue to build on because you implemented something that's interesting. And I think enterprises tend to not think very agilely that way. They tend to think of wholesale transformation. The problem with that is the transformation is so massive. People throw so many requirements on that. You get so much scope creep that you can't contain something to demonstrate value. But if you can contain something to demonstrate value, it gets deployed, you get the win, and then you keep building on it. And sometimes that requires, to your comment on scoping, a very real conversation around, hey, this data is easily accessible, this one's not. Wonder if the insights and the value that we drive are because we leverage this and this, but we have to build this later. Is that going to be enough? Is it not enough along the way? Another, strong area of transformation tends to be in demand planning, because and I like demand planning applications, which are, ultimately, if you're building or manufacturing something, like how do you understand how much needs to be made, where it needs to go, etc. The cool parts about things like demand planning are there are lots of data sets that can be fairly easily structured. And so projects like that where, take my procurement example previously, if you're in that procurement world where there's no structured data whatsoever, it's a huge lift. It's a massive lift, not just to read the documents, but to figure out what the structure is you want. Because now you got to figure out the structure, you got to figure out what the alerts are, you got to figure out like what triggers what, how you categorize it, what you care about versus something what someone else might. So that's a whole bunch of heavy lifting, strategic thinking. In the case of, say, demand planning, oftentimes you know what products that you produce, where they have to go, what customers are expecting, and what type of location, what your capacity is in manufacturing, what your raws are coming in. Like there's all of these known elements that tend to be fairly structured data. If you can get teams to scope those, then you have a shot at doing that. But even in those cases, everything comes down to what's the problem you're trying to solve? Because people bloat stuff very quickly. They're like, oh, let's go from demand planning to sales planning. Well, guess what? Those are whole other requirements. They're not even in the same ballpark. And their inputs are even different. And so if you do that, you set the project up for failure. And so I find the most successful ones are the places where we can scope it, but we can scope it into a place where we know the minimum, everyone's aligned on the value that will get created on day one, and they're also okay with it growing. And organizations, because people aren't super technical, they have a hard time appreciating that. Even in manufacturing lines, when we were talking about the other solution, people bloat those things so fast. They're like, well, it's got to do this, and it's got to do this, and it should do this, and why can't it do this? And you're constantly forcing people to step back and say, we need to show value in the most important thing first that's possible. Because then we figure out the bugs, we figure out what's happening, we drive the transformation, and we run into those elements. And I would say in all the AI deployments I've done, which are a fair amount in the enterprise, people are the greatest challenge because of a lack of understanding of the expectations or the scope creep that happens, or they're wanting to so rapidly add features in and the team doesn't know how to push back and say, let's just align on if we do this, we win. And so that's what's creating massive delays inside of the organizations. I would also say in a lot of them, because they're based on data, a lot of times in organizations, people have made decisions based on their gut or based on the last customer that yelled the loudest. And so then that has influenced process change inside of organizations. AI is now using data. And so people also want to argue with the data that's coming out of it, and they believe their data calculations are better than the AI. So there's also this interesting tension that exists between those stacks, because even if the AI is like, say, 3% better today than the humans are, the humans still don't tend to believe. So you also have these really fascinating cultural transformations that have to happen about how do you get people to trust the inputs? How are they part of the process so that they believe it, so that it can truly help their organization? I think that's what's also leading to applications not being deployed.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And a lot of times we're working with that issue of trust. And sometimes you want to have these built-in verification loops,
Yes.
human in the loop, where instead of just trusting or not trusting the AI, you're building in the right human AI teaming framework where there are these checkpoints where humans are verifying the outputs, and that can be very different from application to application. But yeah, it all has to be carefully engineered and orchestrated. There's a lot to pay attention to with these things.
I agree. There's no, I think that's why people are talking about it so often. There's not one playbook that's working in every instance because organizations grew up differently, right? The organic nature for how they were built means all their data is not commonly structured. They don't have their governance policies consistently. Some departments are more sophisticated than others. Some users are more sophisticated than others. Some things you can't disrupt because it's so core to the business. This complexity inside of the enterprise means that while we understand abstractly the elements that you take to deploy successful AI, the playbook of exactly what happens is fundamentally different. Not everyone has a data lake with a tool on top of it, with an AI infrastructure underneath it, which are usually required for these inside of the enterprise. I think that's why we're so focused on the individual transformation versus what's happening in the enterprise, because it's a lot of work to make sure our enterprises move there quickly.
Absolutely. And you can even take two enterprise orgs within the same industry of similar size, and they can be wildly different in
Agreed.
terms of the state of their data, the way it's structured and stored. their culture, their operations, and all sorts of other things, right? And this is why, Talbot West has positioned itself as a kind of an orchestration partner with a very customized approach, is precisely for this reason, because we see that there are lots of great products out there. And if you're a product, then you're trying to be the solution for everybody, and you might only be a fit for a small percentage because of this, all the nuance and the differentiation between companies. So that's why we've chosen to position ourselves that way, and we see it's a much needed gap in the marketplace.
Agreed.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation. You have been a very informative guest. I've appreciated you coming on and sharing your insights.
Well, thanks for having me. I love that you're talking about this. I think it's really the next big wave of focus for everyone is how do you move from the individual to true enterprise transformation.